So, what was the first company you saw or situation you saw where you really kind of sat up in your seat and said, "All right, we got to really take notice of this"?
Our streets
Yeah.
can handle a fair amount of chaos. Everything from, running into our fire trucks and more importantly, simply bricking in the middle of our streets. The way that the regulatory structure has been created have one primary safety metric, and that is collision avoidance. But
Don't hit
it's the
things.
one that they focus on. And
Mhm.
so in order to avoid collisions, when AVs get confused, they come to a complete stop wherever they happen to be.
Mm. Jeffrey Tumlin is a 30-year transportation leader who has helped cities and tech companies rethink mobility to boost economies, cut emissions, and make streets safer and more joyful. After 2 decades at Nelson Nygaard, he helped launch Oakland's DOT and later led the SFMTA through the pandemic, guiding the agency through major revenue losses while driving cultural change and improving staff performance. I've been hoping to have you on my podcast for a while. We finally made it happen, Jeff. How are you?
I'm great. I'm on sabbatical, but it's good to finally be here.
Yeah, definitely. And this is our first time meeting virtually. All right. Well, I think that's a great starting point. One of the reasons why, I've wanted to talk to you for so long, and especially now in this, sort of renaissance and explosion of AVs that we're seeing on the streets of San Francisco and LA and Phoenix, is you were one of the first people, I think, in a position, regulatory position of power when robotaxis, started hitting the streets of San Francisco. When did they first come onto your radar?
Well, they were on our radar even before COVID because
Hmm.
they were in testing in San Francisco. Of course, the whole arrival of them in great numbers and finally having passenger service
Yeah.
happened under my watch of the SFMTA. And of course, the year of insanity of AVs was 2023 in San
Mm.
Francisco. That is when many of the worst, craziest incidents happened on our streets, and that is when crews shut down.
Hmm. So you started with the SFMTA, it looks like in December 2019. What is the SFMTA responsible for?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the SFMTA is the Department of Transportation for San Francisco. We
Hmm.
controlled all of the streets of the city. The SFMTA is also the operator of Muni, which carries about half of the San Francisco Bay Area's transit riders.
Got it. And that is subways, trains. What is Muni?
So Muni is the two little subways in San Francisco, plus all the buses and streetcars and cable cars.
Got it.
Muni is not BART, which is the regional rail operator.
Got it. Okay, cool. So you were there kind of right at the beginning. And I think you also mentioned that, I feel like I've been going to San Francisco for many years, and it was really one of the first places where even before you would see these vehicles with LiDARs and spinning things and maps and cameras. And so it's actually maybe even been more than 5 years that they've sort of been testing, and you've seen cool futuristic vehicles for maybe more than 5 years, right?
That's right. And also remember that San Francisco has been a leader in mobility technology since
Hmm.
failed gold miner Andrew Halliday used mining ore cart technology to invent the cable car. So Cruise was founded in San Francisco, Waymo a few miles down the peninsula.
Hmm.
Many of the other technology companies, half of the shared scooter companies,
Yeah.
were all founded and or did their primary testing here.
Yeah,
Uber and
can't forget
Lyft as
Uber.
well,
Yeah,
both
can't
founded,
forget
still
Uber
have
and
their
Lyft
headquarters.
too,
Yeah.
right? They're sort of the OGs in this space, and maybe what caused it all, depending on your perspective. So, what was the first, I guess, company you saw, or sort of situation you saw where you really kind of sat up in your seat and said, "All right, we got to really take notice of this"?
Well, it ramped up starting in around 2020, but particularly in 2021, as
Yeah.
more and more vehicles were out there on the street. So, it's San Francisco. It's the
Mhm.
streets of San Francisco. There's chaos on our streets every day. Our streets
Yeah.
can handle a fair amount of chaos. And we really wanted to be supportive of these homegrown companies who were promising to be able to help us with safety on our streets, a
Mm.
huge local priority. And, we were noticing an increasing level of chaos. And that's, everything from, running into our fire trucks to
Yeah.
getting, ignoring yellow caution tape and getting tangled up in high voltage electrical wire,
Yeah.
driving into construction sites, and more importantly, simply bricking in the middle of our streets.
Mm.
So autonomous vehicles, the way that the regulatory structure has been created, have one primary safety metric, and that is collision avoidance. And
Mhm.
it's an important safety metric, but
Don't hit
it's the
things.
one that they focus on. And
Mhm.
so In order to avoid collisions, when AVs get confused, they come to a complete stop wherever they happen to be.
Mm,
And so they were starting to create not only traffic chaos on our streets, but
yeah.
also significant safety problems for other roadway users.
Got it. So, how do you track something like that that's more qualitative in nature, right? I mean, I'm sure I've seen reports where, the same, 20 people make thousands of reports. I feel like you're probably the expert in this. So, what is it? Is it just a sense? What are the data inputs or the inputs you're looking at to say, oh, wow, this is a problem. We need to look at it, and not just, someone complaining 50 times?
So for the transportation services that we regulate or
Hmm.
operate, we get that directly from the surface, right? Safety and transparency are a priority, including for shared scooter operators.
Hmm.
And the last thing you want to be as executive director is picking up the phone, taking a media call about a
Hmm.
serious safety incident on your street
Yeah.
and learning about that first from the media rather than the company or service involved. So, our challenge with AVs is the lack of direct reporting about safety information.
Mm.
So, we get limited data from the California Public Utilities Commission and the federal government 3 to 6 months after the fact,
Yeah.
mostly redacted. So, for us, getting no information direct from industry, it was incredibly painful for us that the primary source of information for what was happening on our streets were 911 calls,
Mm.
311 calls, reports from first responders and our transit operators,
Hmm.
and social media.
Yeah.
And so, our staff had to spend an immense amount of
Mm.
time sorting through that information, trying to figure out, is this one incident or is this 1,000
Hmm.
people reporting the same incident or 1,000 people reporting 1,000 incidents
Yeah.
in order to just get a sense of what are the patterns and what is the policy response that we need to have as a city, particularly around issues like training our police officers or our first responders or human traffic control officers
Yeah.
how to manage this chaos that was happening on our streets.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission. They're typically the ones who regulate ride hail, TNCs, Waymo, the AV companies. But I guess they are operating on your streets, though. So that must be frustrating.
That's right. In California, cities have zero regulatory control over autonomous
Hmm.
vehicles, including not being able to issue a citation to them when they break the law, which they do every day.
Yeah.
And so we're reliant on the California Public Utilities Commission and NHTSA at the federal level
Hmm.
in order to help steer the industry towards better public trust, better safety outcomes, and ultimately American leadership in this promising technology.
Yeah. So how did these companies do early on? It sounds like not great, kind of working with cities, and maybe what could they have done or what could they do better?
Well, it took a couple of years of practice that felt like beating our heads against a wall to
Mm.
understand that probably at the root of the problem is a sharp cultural difference between city governments and private technology companies.
Hmm.
So in cities, particularly around safety, we take a very strong safety culture approach that is
Yeah.
rooted in transparency and immediately disclosing and investigating
Yeah.
any kind of issue, and then looking for patterns and
Hmm.
finding quick ways to solve the problem. Certainly, as a transit operator, and for the technologies that we regulate, like shared scooters, this is our approach. For autonomous vehicle companies, particularly in an early stage of development, culturally, they, among their greatest fears are giving out trade secret information that their
Hmm.
competitors can use in order to outcompete them for funding or for technology delivery. And so they're culturally extremely reticent to
Hmm.
share critical information. And so
Got
there
it.
was simply a culture clash
Yeah.
between government expectation and how we need to be transparent while operating in the public and what these players were doing. And I think that they didn't really quite understand what it was like to operate in the public, to have everyone with a cell phone taking pictures of
Yeah.
AVs behaving badly and then not disclosing information about what actually happened and what they're
Hmm.
doing in order to make progress to reduce the chances of the same situation happening again. So pretty significant culture clash.
Yeah. I mean, so it sounds like I think culture clash is the best way to describe it. I mean, AV companies and cities, I don't, it sounds like they don't have the same interest. They don't have the same, they don't care about the same things. And I guess my question is that okay? I mean, do they have to?
Well, actually, one of the things that we found in the Federal Transforming Transportation Advisory Committee approach is that actually the desired outcomes for
Hmm.
cities and AV companies are very much in alignment.
Yeah.
So, AV companies, in order to succeed in the marketplace, need to generate public trust. They need to have a positive image. Similarly, in order for their service to actually work, they can't be congesting up the streets.
Yeah.
In order for AVs to be functional in cities, they can't be taking ridership from the most efficient modes of transportation, like
Hmm.
public transit or walking
Yeah.
or biking. And so, from an end state perspective, I think there is a tremendous amount of alignment.
Yeah.
Where there is challenge is in their secrecy concerns and fear of revealing bad news
Hmm.
in the early stages of development. But I would argue that the way to get around this problem is through much smarter regulation than
Hmm.
we currently have, which is not to say more regulation, it's to say smarter regulation that allows these technologies to develop as quickly as they possibly can while making sure that the best performers thrive.
Got it. So we don't have to spend the whole time on this topic, but I do think it's important and interesting because there are a lot of cities out there that, Waymo is just being introduced and there's going to be other AV operators hitting the streets. So I guess kind of on the put a final pin in this, what is one example of something that you either did or that, you think is reasonable and feasible that folks could do to kind of make these early days a lot smoother for both parties?
Well, I mean, I think the answer depends upon what state you're in.
Hmm.
So in California, cities have no regulatory control and effectively no leverage over AV companies, except for example, access to airports, which are
Mm-hmm.
important to AV services. I think the real thing that can be done in states like Washington, New York, Massachusetts, et cetera, is learning from the successes and failures in California in
Hmm.
order to create a a regulatory approach that helps industry thrive,
Hmm.
that focuses on developing public trust, and that upholds the public good, particularly around safety, not just of the AV occupant, but
Hmm.
safety of the transportation system as a whole.
Got it. And it sounds like maybe the one ask I might make in one of those states might be more data, everything that's going on with these companies.
That's right. Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg famously said, "Trust in God, but for everything else, bring me data." Right? Cities are used to operating in public with transparency, and data is at the root
Yeah.
of how we make operational and policy decisions. We need some basic data, and there needs to be a level playing field around that data, that protects personally identifiable information and trade
Hmm.
secrets, but lets cities know what's happening, allowing us to track steady improvement. That's what we want to see, not
Yeah.
looking for perfection. We're looking for steady improvement.
Well said. So, in researching for this interview, I saw a quote that you made about a year ago. I'm going to read it off here, and because I think it's a good jumping point into some of the other topics I want to get into. You said in an interview with our friend David Zipper about AVs, so far they're referring to Waymo and I think other AVs. So far, there is no net positive for the transportation system that we've been able to identify. The robotaxis create greater convenience for the privilege, but they create problems for the efficiency of the transportation system as a whole. Great quote. Do you still feel that? And do you think it's, maybe too harsh on AVs, or you think that that's sort of where we're at?
Well, that's where we're at this stage of development, which
Mhm.
doesn't suggest that we're not going to get to a place where they're going to provide significant net benefit for cities.
Got it.
What we want to do is to make sure that we're having our eyes open about the
Mhm.
unintended negative consequences, but also capturing the unintended positive consequences that no one's really talking about,
Mm.
but could be profound for cities.
I like that. Well, I'm going to start with the negative, but we'll definitely get to the positive. So, what is the number one unintended negative consequence you think people aren't talking about, or you think they're not aware of when it comes to AVs?
Well, I mean, there's a sort of long list
You got to
of
pick one, Jeff.
unintended consequences. Well, let's talk about traffic congestion. I
Okay.
think that there's this myth out there that autonomous and particularly connected autonomous vehicles
Mm,
will magically make traffic go away. And indeed, this was a promise that Uber and Lyft, and particularly Lyft, were making back in 2012.
hmm
And the idea was, and there were these great video simulations, and John Zimmer at Lyft was, really a true believer that
Yeah.
being able to access a Lyft vehicle would mean that you no longer had to own your own car,
Mm,
and that the rides would be shared. You'd facilitate a car-free lifestyle. People could use transit for the trips where transit made sense, but then use Lyft for the trips where transit wasn't there. And John tried so hard to make the vision work. And of course, what we found is the exact opposite.
hmm
Uber and Lyft both dramatically increased vehicle miles traveled in cities like San Francisco. They had no discernible impact on auto ownership in households. For all of their efforts of promoting shared Uber and Lyft services, all of those efforts were basically abandoned. People want to ride alone or with their friend
Yeah.
and don't want to go 20 minutes out of their way to pick somebody else up. From a user convenience standpoint, Uber and Lyft were highly successful. From a transportation system efficiency perspective, they were terrible. They meant that we could move fewer people on the streets of San Francisco, even as our economy and our population were growing. So, what we need from
hmm
transportation technology is the ability to move more people and goods on streets that are not getting any wider. So, Uber, Lyft, Waymo are pushing us in the opposite direction. And that will be particularly true for autonomous vehicles in that in order for them to compete against Uber and Lyft, they need to be able to deliver their services at a lower price point to the consumer.
Yeah.
So if Waymo is cheaper than Uber, we're going to see again an even greater increase in vehicle miles traveled and resulting traffic congestion and transit delay and constrained economies for economic growth in cities.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with you that Uber and Lyft, a lot of what they promise, I would kind of give a little more credit to Lyft because, John had that vision. And I mean, to be
Yeah.
fair, I was a Lyft driver and Uber driver 11 years ago. I mean, the whole model was, ride with a friend. They encourage you to sit in the front. So at least, I think they were somewhat honest about those beginnings and it didn't end up playing like that. But I do feel like, Uber and Lyft, all the data is clear. They're increasing congestion. I also feel like, though, they're an easy scapegoat. I think there's been studies in the past. We have a write up on the rideshare guy that we refer to a lot. Article actually I'm seeing here, Laura Bliss in Bloomberg City
Mhm.
Lab. And there was a study, and I'm looking at San Francisco, not to put you on the spot, but it says 12.8% of vehicle miles traveled, VMT, is from Uber and Lyft. And so I think the stats I've seen, of the recent congestion, they're a majority, right? Because they didn't
Yeah.
exist. And now there are a lot of the new congestion. But actually, on an absolute basis, San Francisco is one of the highest cities. And most other cities, like Los Angeles, for example, there are a lot of cars, right? 2.6% Uber and Lyft. So I feel like they are increasing congestion and making some of those things worse. Do you feel that they're kind of an easy scapegoat? Hey, I mean, traffic was pretty bad in San Francisco, LA, all these cities before Uber and Lyft. It's gotten worse, a little worse, a lot worse. Maybe that's subjective, maybe not, but it's kind of easy to blame them.
I'm not blaming Uber and Lyft for traffic congestion. What I'm saying is that their promise of reducing traffic congestion
Okay,
was completely invalid and the opposite occurred. I think the
that's fair.
lesson is that cities need to recognize that there will always be a tension between user convenience and
hmm
system efficiency. And the private market is always going to try to focus on user convenience for the affluent, because
Right.
that's the only way to have any hope of making money in the
hmm
mobility space. And so there is simply that tension. That tension is
hmm
true in every city in the world. And so the municipal response needs to be physical changes that
hmm
prioritize the most geometrically efficient mobility. It's one of the reasons why we accelerated the installation of transit-only lanes on
Hmm.
all of our key bus corridors, is knowing that we needed to defend ourselves
Yeah.
against rising congestion from a variety of sources. But it also speaks to the fundamental misconstruing that so many Americans have that don't understand that congestion is simply what happens when the demand for mobility equals the supply.
Hmm.
And that for every other commodity in our society, we balance supply and demand using price. But in transportation, we balance supply and demand using time. We make a
Hmm.
policy choice to allow our streets to be congested because we conflate our, personal liberty and freedoms with the actual freeness of being able to drive. And so, New York has solved the problem
Yeah.
of the concern about congestion from AVs destroying mobility in the city through congestion pricing, right?
Yeah. So I
Singapore,
guess that, yeah, that kind of ties into my point. I like the idea of congestion pricing. I think Uber and Lyft were big supporters of
yep,
congestion pricing actually in New York City because it does apply to the other 87 plus percent of road users, right? So
yep,
everyone's sort of treated fairly in that sense. So, and I think the other, right now, I think there was a report by Obi, Waymo charges 30 to 40% more than Uber and Lyft. But the whole promise of AVs is to be cheaper, right? So that should actually tell you they're going to induce more demand, maybe even more congestion than Uber and Lyft, right? So what do we do
that's
about
exactly
it?
right. Well, I mean, like I said, I think you need to do several things. You need to, number one, protect the most space efficient modes of
Okay.
transportation, bus only lanes, and protected bikeways, right? These are things that cities should be doing anyways.
Hmm.
And we need to accept the fact that we've known for 90 years now that adding traffic lanes doesn't solve for congestion.
Right.
The only things that solve for congestion are number one, destroying your municipal economy, or number two, decongestion pricing.
There you
So,
go.
if anything, I would hope that our fears around a dramatic increase in VMT from autonomous vehicles will help cities do what we should have done 40 years ago.
Yeah. It might be the kickstart we need for other cities, and obviously New York City did it. And I think all the results are pretty positive to implement decongestion pricing. So interesting stuff. The other big thing I see when it comes to Waymo and their positive benefit on cities and society, there was a huge op ed in the New York Times this week by a doctor, and it's the safety argument that Waymo is much safer than human drivers. And so I'd love to get your take on that. Waymo has released a bunch of data comparing their trips to human trips. And I also would say that, just kind of look around when you're driving on the roads and you see people tired, honking, mad on their phones a lot. Like, I don't think it takes much to be safer than a human driver. But that would be my personal, anecdotal, very subjective opinion. So what do you think there?
Well, so I think there's two separate questions that
Mm.
many readers and listeners are conflating. One question is, for this trip, is it safer for me to take a Waymo than it
Mm.
is to drive myself or take an Uber? And I think the data is clear that Waymos are really, really good at
Hmm.
avoiding running into things because,
Got it.
again, that is the single metric that
Mm.
both NHTSA and industry have fixated on is
Mm.
collision avoidance, a very important metric. But for every other mode of transportation, we have dozens of other metrics, as well as a focus on safety culture in our
Mhm.
processes. So that's one question is this trip safer for me? There's another question which is related but separate, which is, will this technology make the transportation system safer? So if all Waymo is doing is increasing vehicle miles traveled in San Francisco and not getting the worst drivers out of their cars and into a Waymo, no matter
Mhm.
how safe Waymo is, it is not going to make the transportation system safer,
Got it.
right? So as a city official, my job was the transportation system as a whole.
Mhm.
And what our biggest concern was is what are these trips substituting for? Or is this simply an increase in vehicle traffic? And again, learning from our 2012
Mhm.
experience with Uber and Lyft, what we were seeing is an increase in vehicle miles traveled, and substitution from Uber and Lyft into Waymo, as well as some substitution from public transit into Waymo and Cruise.
So, to the credit of the doctor in the New York Times article or opinion piece, I did like that he actually brought up that, some of the safest modes of transit are public, trains, buses,
Mhm.
things like that. And, if we're replacing those with Waymo trips, it's actually could be much worse, even though
That's
Waymos
right.
are safer than typical cars. So, I think it sounds like looking at the transportation system as a whole, kind of ties into your last point with congestion, right? Still need to encourage people to take the safest modes and make sure that Waymo and other AVs aren't pulling from those safest modes. And then I guess when it comes to replacing personal vehicle trips, though, I mean, if it's 10 times safer, wouldn't replacing, half of those trips be a net positive?
So you're assuming that all drivers are average safe
Mm,
drivers,
gotcha.
right? So for the worst drivers on our streets, the danger is the perk, not the bug.
Okay.
And what we're not seeing is any interest from the worst drivers, the ones that are
Mm.
creating the worst safety problems on our streets. Those folks are not interested in getting out of their car and taking a Waymo instead.
So this is the very common in the, and I'm not an insurance expert, but it comes up all the time in shared fleets, right? That a
Yep,
very small number of drivers cause all the accidents, right? It's
that's right.
basically that is happening here, and they're not getting into Waymo. So it kind of depends on which drivers you're substituting.
That's right. And then there are also other factors as well. Like most pickup and drop off for AVs in San Francisco is either in the traffic lane or in the bike lane.
Hmm.
And so none of the AV companies report on what happens to the cyclist who now has to veer into traffic in
Hmm.
order to get around, an AV that's doing a pickup and drop off. If that cyclist gets run over by a car, that is not
Hmm.
recorded as an AV safety problem. So again, as a city, we want to understand the impact on the whole transportation system. And
Hmm.
we're not getting any data about systemic impacts.
So should cities embrace AVs or should they be,
So
resistant, cautious,
no, I mean,
optimistic?
the answer is yes, absolutely. We need to
Hmm.
embrace AVs. And we need a regulatory structure that gets real safety data in order to demonstrate the degree to which these companies are making continuous improvement. But very importantly, there needs to be built-in stage gates. Again,
Hmm.
the transportation system in cities can handle a good deal of chaos, but unlimited AVs in terms of number, in terms of where they can drive, in terms
Yeah.
of in what kinds of weather they can drive, AVs should only be allowed to operate in an unlimited way based upon their ability to demonstrate that they can meet certain clear safety tests, right?
Hmm.
So an AV needs to understand human traffic control officers in order to be allowed to drive on downtown streets at rush hour when we've got human traffic control officers there, right?
Yeah.
AV needs to be geofenced from approaching any emergency response site if it doesn't understand that it's not allowed to drive over a fire hose or
Hmm.
even what a fire hose is. You know, if it hasn't demonstrated that it can handle heavy fog or heavy rain or snow, then we need a regulatory structure that prevents AVs from doing that. And this is not only to protect cities, it's also to protect the industry itself. Because what we kept finding, particularly with Cruise,
Hmm.
is Cruise was having there was this pattern of every 3 months, the level of Cruise doing insane things on our streets would peak. And we couldn't figure out what this pattern was until we thought, oh my God, this is when their quarterly returns are due to their shareholders, and they haven't met their targets yet. And so if you are a developing technology company, the pressure to meet targets to your shareholders is so high that the pressure to take crazy risks
Hmm.
that put not only your company at risk, but the reputation of the entire industry at risk. We need structures in order to help save technology companies from themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and
And I think the model actually is the history of aviation and the Civilian Aviation Board in the 1930s. Right. I mean, here in the United States, we have the worst traffic safety records in the world, or at least in the industrialized world. and the best safety records in the aviation space.
Yeah. True.
And looking at the divergence in the safety and regulatory approaches for automotive mobility versus aviation mobility offers, I think, a lot of lessons for how cities and the country can help the AV industry thrive while
Mhm.
also making things safer for the whole transportation system.
Yeah. So you mentioned Cruise. I mean, they were the most infamous, I think, incident, or one of the most infamous incidents, and it happened in San Francisco, I believe, while you were head of SFMTA. And, I think there is this worry now in the AV industry. I get a question from reporters, what happens if there's a serious incident? Could it, I mean, one incident kind of killed Cruise. So maybe you could kind of recount that incident, the lessons learned, and we can talk about some of the, sort of up-to-date story, because I know there have been a couple animal deaths with Waymo in San Francisco lately, and I think they all kind of tie in together. But it's basically, how do we handle cities, people, public, if or when something bad happens?
Yeah. So, and the Cruise story is a very interesting one, and one that few writers have reported on accurately.
All right.
So let me give you my version of the story. So I mean, 2023 was a crazy year for AVs in San Francisco.
Hmm.
Yeah, we can talk about other incidents later if you want. But in October of 2023, there was in downtown San Francisco a 4-lane, 2-way street
Hmm.
where a woman was jaywalking, like walking
Hmm.
against the light into traffic.
Hmm.
A human-driven car struck her in the crosswalk
Hmm.
and then sped off. A cruise vehicle was coming up on the right of the human-driven vehicle. The woman was basically bounced off of the human-driven car, struck by the cruise vehicle, went under the cruise vehicle.
Hmm.
The cruise vehicle paused and then drove off about a block away with the woman stuck in the wheel well of the car. She lived, but was hospitalized for over a year, mostly in intensive care.
Mm.
So this was a horrific incident.
Yeah.
The incident itself is not what brought Cruise down.
Hmm.
Cruise, in reporting to their regulators, how I wish I could remember the exact political words that the California Public Utilities Commission staff used, but it was something to the effect of Cruise was not fully disclosing the story of what had happened. So
Mm.
Cruise withheld critical safety information
Yeah.
from its state regulator. And I feel like for us as a public transit operator, this was just so utterly unthinkable. Like you
Hmm.
never, ever withhold information. If anything, when there's
Right.
a critical safety information, you put all of the information out there.
Hmm.
And Cruz somehow thought, like, I mean, as the city, we had 4 cameras on this
Hmm.
intersection, right? Like, we had the whole story, and that
Yeah.
Cruz hid critical information again, like, and thought that they could get away with it was just
Mm.
completely insane. So, the incident itself, we believed that because of Waymo's superior technology, Waymo likely would have avoided the crash.
Hmm.
Cruise's limited technology meant that, like, Cruise didn't have any sort of object permanence. It just
Hmm.
sort of reacts to what's in front of it. And so it was understandable. Like, we understood why the crash happened. And from a Cruise technology development standpoint, perhaps unavoidable.
Hmm.
The other factor, though, that aside from effectively lying to the state safety regulators, the other factor is the things that AVs don't understand. So the cruise vehicle knew that it had hit something
Hmm.
and knew that its algorithm was, okay, I've hit something. Now I'm going to find a place to pull over. And that, generally speaking, is correct. But the cruise AV intelligence couldn't understand that the thing that it had hit was a person. And now I don't know where that person is,
Mm.
which relates to the more recent incident that Waymo had with Kit Kat the cat down on Mission Street
Yeah.
at 16th and Mission, where these vehicles I mean, humans don't have the ability to see under our vehicles,
Hmm.
but we do have the ability to know, oh, like we've hit something.
Right.
My normal protocol would be to pull over, but first I need to figure out where this pedestrian is.
Right.
In the case of the Kit Kat incident, there was a bar patron who was trying to extricate the cat out from under the
Hmm.
car and was, kneeling down, trying to get the
Right.
cat out and like, trying to get the car to stop. And if it were a human driver, you would go like this. That is
Right.
the
What's
symbol
going
to
on?
roll the window down and have a conversation with the driver to say, no, 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 don't go yet. First, we need to get this cat out.
Hmm.
AVs have no ability to have two-way communication like that or
Yeah.
to read hand signals. And so the AV, in its simple technology, didn't understand that it shouldn't pull out when there is a cat hiding next to one of its wheels.
Right. Or it may not have even known it was a cat under there. I think the video
No.
was just
Yep.
released. And that was the thing that I noticed. There's a bar patron. She's sort of, looking under the car. And as soon as she pops up and the human's out of the way, the Waymo, sort of
Yep.
takes off. And I think basically almost every human in that situation would have known, hey, if she was looking for something, probably something important,
Yep.
right? And I should stick around.
Yeah. But it also speaks to the fact that mobility in cities is a social phenomenon. It is
Mm.
not a rule-based set of algorithms.
Mm.
And things as simple as a urban stop sign controlled intersection, right? When a lot of vehicles all kind of arrive at a stop sign controlled intersection where there are pedestrians,
Yeah.
there's a sort of dance of nodding and waving and
Mm.
no, no, and you go that AVs can't do because they're
Yeah.
incapable of two-way communication. And frankly, they don't have a face.
Yeah.
One of the things that, I was talking about 8 years ago is the importance of even just a cartoon face
Hmm.
to allow AVs to be able to communicate, oh, no, I see you, or no, I'm going to go
Hmm.
because I need to get through this intersection. Over more skillful ways of being able to immediately communicate, particularly with first responders.
Yeah.
AVs are going to end up at emergency response scenes.
Mhm.
If it's a human-driven vehicle, it's very easy for a firefighter to say, no, turn around, go. Or if the vehicle is immobilized, the first responder can break the window, get into the vehicle, and physically,
Mhm.
remove it herself.
So I think I'm not sure what you would categorize these types of, almost like human-like interactions. This is the area where I think, one of the areas where even Waymo, which I think has done a great job and the product people love, they struggle. There's a video the other day, of them driving through a crime scene with a guy on the ground. Even the guy
Yep.
on the ground looks up and is like, did someone just
It's
drive
like,
through
what?
this crime scene?
What's going on?
And that one's a little obnoxious and funny, but obviously some are not and are more, animals or people might be dying. So I guess how do we solve this?
Well, it's a tricky question. I mean, part of the challenge is the nature of truly urban cities. One of the
Mhm.
things that was fascinating to us in 2023, while we were pulling out our hair as AVs were, causing significant problems in our transportation system, Phoenix was having a great time.
Mm.
Right. There were no problems in Phoenix. I mean, there were some first responder issues, but
Yeah.
they dealt with the first responder issues, I think, very skillfully. And it made us realize, like, oh, Phoenix kind of looks like a computer simulation of the city.
Hmm.
In San Francisco, like there's just a level of chaos
Yeah.
and unpredictability that requires human social communication and social
Mm.
awareness in order to navigate skillfully. So what it says to me is AVs are ready for the suburbs.
Hmm.
These are going to continue to have challenges in cities, particularly as their numbers increase.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. Phoenix, flat, grid, not a lot of cars. San Francisco's kind of the
Lots of traffic
opposite.
lanes. Yeah, exactly.
But is there sort of, I mean, it seems like, I don't know, maybe a solution that the AV companies need to figure out more, but I guess like what can we kind of do now to avoid some of these situations?
Well, again, I think for states that are currently contemplating AV regulation,
Hmm.
developing the regulations in a way that reward rapid progress
Mm,
in the long list of areas where AV
got it.
struggles. Interaction with first responders, human traffic
Yeah.
control, construction sites, pickup and drop off interactions, blocking traffic and blocking the bikeway, handling major events,
Hmm.
like the traffic chaos that AVs create at major events in San Francisco is
Hmm.
really reducing our ability to move people in and out of
Yeah,
major events, right? I mean,
definitely.
we've got video from, I don't know, like a month and a half ago of AVs blocking 3 lanes of traffic at the
Yeah,
Symphony because, 70 people ordered an AV all at the same time.
right.
Is queuing, taking up an entire street in downtown San Francisco, getting ready to go pick people up at Chase Arena, but
Yeah.
meanwhile blocking traffic in all directions.
Yeah, definitely. So, I want to end on a positive note here. We've been teasing some of the upsides of AV tech that no one's talking about, and I think you've actually highlighted a few in some of your recent talks and panels. So, what are some of the upsides that you think
Yeah.
are out there?
And I really want to emphasize those. So also, like, I'm a regular Waymo user. I like
Yeah.
taking Waymo. It's utterly fascinating to me. So one of the miracles of Waymo is they follow the speed limit,
Yeah.
which is like seems really simple, but is kind of insane. And while following the speed limit is great, and I think it helps Waymo with collision avoidance, there's a secondary benefit that I think far outweighs the primary
Mm,
benefit, which is that, when Waymo reaches about 10% of the fleet, that's enough Waymos following the speed limit that it forces everyone else in the road
mm,
to follow the speed limit as well. And that's one key area of research that I would love to try to track is how is Waymo creating safer conditions for everyone else in the road?
yeah. If you're
So
surrounded by Waymos going 25 miles an hour, you
yeah,
have to go 25 too,
you have to
right?
get, yeah, exactly. Waymo's also pretty, like, if I'm riding a bike, I would so much rather be riding a bike
Yeah.
next to or in front of a Waymo than any human driven vehicle
Hmm.
because they are endlessly patient.
Yeah.
I like playing the game when I'm riding in a Waymo of who could spot the pedestrian first, me for the Waymo. And oftentimes the Waymo beats me.
Mm,
And Waymo is increasingly good at object permanence, about predicting pedestrian and cyclist behavior, even when those pedestrians go behind like a box truck
right.
and can't be seen. Waymo's anticipating now where the pedestrian is going to pop out and reacting accordingly. Waymos are beloved by vulnerable passengers. So
Mm,
women, people who are non-gender conforming, people who are neurodivergent, they love not having to interact with a human or accepting the risks that comes with a human operated, taxi or Uber. Waymos are beloved by the hearing impaired community,
mhm.
obviously not by people who use wheelchairs, but a lot easier. Like Waymo has gone out of their way to provide incredibly precise guidance to, I'm sorry, to not to the hearing impaired community, but to the visually impaired and
Yeah.
blind community. Waymo provides very precise instructions for being able to access the vehicle. It's
On
super
I've
helpful for
interviewed
people who are
actually a
blind.
blind passenger recently
Yep,
who had a service dog, and really, I mean, it's a pretty serious issue for her taking Uber and Lyft.
that's
She
right.
had situations where the driver would see her drive off because they don't want, even if that's a service dog, she had a foot in the car. So I definitely, I think that's one that I know for sure is a big positive improvement for some folks.
Yeah, and and then there are the possibilities of other improvements.
Mm,
But again, I worry that the pressure to make money
hmm.
in an industry where it's impossible to make money off of mobility, that the financial pressure is going to be too much and other potential benefits will be avoided over time in the kind of the inevitable intuitification, to quote Cory Doctorow, and the patterns that we saw with Uber and Lyft as well, where their performance worsened over time rather than got better as they needed to actually demonstrate financial viability.
But, well, I think we're glad that you're out there highlighting a lot of these areas, whether they're positives, negatives, because I think it sounds like, I really liked what you said about the end state, being very similar, kind of goals, results that AV companies, that cities all want, whether it's Uber and Lyft or Waymo. And so I think we might need to have you back in a year and check in, and we'll keep tabs on all this. And if folks want to follow you or your work, what's the best place they can find you? And what are you going to be up to these next few months?
You can find me on Blue Sky at Jeffrey Tumlin, one word, or on LinkedIn. At the moment, I am working really hard to avoid gainful employment, but at a certain point, I will need to
Okay.
go back into gainful employment. In the
I was
meantime,
giving
I
you
am
the chance to
writing.
break the news of your next job, but we'll save it for next time.
That's right.